that I have observed in the last 2 years. Folks, analytics is nothing new. Companies have been collecting data and building reports for decades. Some of you have been doing this work since the era of nightly batch reports. Remember those days where we used to print those reports on green bar papers? What's new today is for the first time now, the machine can actually reason over the data using my plain natural language, the way a smart colleague would do that work. And that's essentially a game changer capability. I'm not here talking about any faster storage, not prettier charts, none of that stuff. I'm purely focusing on the reasoning aspect. The system can look at a pattern and tell you what it likely means and what you might do with that data. Think of a difference between here of a calculator versus a finance advisor. A calculator will give you the numbers that you have asked for. On the other hand, an advisor would understand your goals. It will notice something that you have been doing well and equally think about things that you haven't really considered or taken into consideration. Now, what they will do from there is will actually go ahead and tell you how you can improve those things. So for the last 30 years, our analytic tools have predominantly been on the side of a fast calculator, I would say. And what's arriving now is where we are moving close towards a capability of an advisor, and that changes who can use it and how quickly decisions are made. So in this particular section, my goal is to get us all on the same page about the problem that we are solving, and more importantly, why this is urgent. Urgency matters because my organization wants to be ahead. And when I say ahead, it's not just about looking and analyzing my data, but to actually analyze that data in a shorter period of time, but still have those confidence levels higher than what we used to have earlier. So that's what this section is all about. Now, once we share the foundation, everything else, we'll talk about some of our use cases around BigQuery and Gemini and how these two tag team along with each other to make our lives a lot more simple, a lot more easier for us. So this is how our journey will look like for today's session. Look at this particular flow. I'm not starting with a technical conversation here. I'm not talking about, Google's BigQuery as another analytics platform, and I'm not deep diving into that straight away. I'm first here thinking about my business problem, not a data set, not a dashboard, essentially a question. Something like, why did my sales drop in the West Coast region in the last quarter? Now, that's a crucial starting point because it's faced a way human would actually think, not a way a database wants me to query it. That question reaches into your enterprise data, all of your data sources, your structured data. It could be your messy, unstructured data at the same time. Now, BigQuery here would act as my analytics engine that can crunch the data at massive scale in seconds rather than overnight. Then Gemini's layer on the AI reasoning. So when I think about the Gemini layer here, it will interpret, explain, and recommend decisions. Essentially, what I'm thinking about is turning my raw results into something a person can act on. On the other side, you'll get insights that are explained in natural language, but you can also draw visuals from those ones in itself. And lastly, your decisions that you can then act on in few minutes. So again, our key perspective that we really need to be thinking about is how I can go from my business problem, which then gets drawn down into a technical analytical capability, how I can combine both of them and get answers from my favorite generative AI tools, such as Google's Gemini, and then using Gemini's native capabilities, how I can draw insights and I can then create visuals and then end up creating decisions for me that I can act upon in a matter of few minutes. Think it this way. Think about it like a restaurant kitchen. The old model handled a customer's order through, you know, separate rooms in itself. One would fetch the ingredients, one would chop, one would cook, one would put them on the plate. They'll wait for a waiter to come on board and take the food to the customer's table. What I'm now talking about here is more or less like an open kitchen where the order flows straight from the request to a finished plate, and the chef can actually accommodate the specifications that the customers have asked. Again, same ingredients, radically different experience and speed. That's what we are all talking about in this particular instance here itself. All right, here is the reality that keeps every exec up at night. Every organization's data is growing faster than what a human could analyze. You would have read a lot of these reports across Forrester, Gartner, and many other research organizations where they keep telling me that my organizational data, but not only my organization's data, but data holistically across the globe is actually doubling and tripling every 2 to 3 years. And what that essentially means is I can either hire and employ more and more humans, and I can hope that they can keep at pace with all of this data, or I can be a lot more smarter, where rather than wasting a human's time on analyzing my raw data sets, I can empower them with tools that can do that particular job in a fraction time, and then they could actually go ahead and use that particular data to actually go ahead and derive insights from there in itself. So that's essentially where I could be thinking about all of these particular capabilities that I would go ahead and use from here in itself. Now, folks, what I'm thinking about here in itself is we need to think about a few different other capabilities here at the same time that we really need to be aware of as well. The first one is customer interaction. Every click, every call, every conversation, every support call. You can think about your IoT and sensor events, which would continuously generate telemetry that is streaming from my machines, my vehicles, my devices every second now. Then comes in my transactions and my logs. This is where these logs essentially form the backbone of my operational and financial systems, every order and every system event. And then comes in my documents, images, and videos. Unstructured content exploding at scale, which historically was the hardest bit to actually go ahead and use. Now, this is a key point that I want all of us to remember and perhaps take it to your execs as well. Only a fraction of enterprise data ever becomes actionable insight. And most organizations are sitting on gold mine and mining maybe 2 to 3% insights from that data. The rest of the data just keeps on accumulating, not only from a data size perspective, but also from the cost of storing that data at the same time. What that also means is that I'm at the same time carrying compliance risk, and it never informs a single decision. You're paying rent on it and getting nothing back. Think of it like a library where I've got a lot of books that keeps arriving on a day-to-day basis, 24 hours a day, but you only have time to read the covers. The knowledge is not in the building. It's actually about how I'm consuming that particular data. And that's what most enterprises are stuck towards. They are data rich, but they are poor on the actual insights. Now, when I think about that unstructured data that I've got in my organization, in today's context, I would say that really deserves a special mention. Why? Because it's where my generative AI actually comes in and it becomes a game changer. For decades, my videos, my PDFs, my call recordings, my images were essentially invisible to analytics. You couldn't put them into a spreadsheet. A company like Geotab, which handles my telematics from millions of, let's say, connected vehicle, lives and dies by turning that fire hose of sensor data into something a fleet manager could act on. The organizations that figure out how to reason over all their data, not just the neat tabular part. And what that means is it unlocks majority that was essentially dead weight in the past. So this is where I essentially want you all to think about that there's a lot more things that we can now go ahead and deliver in a fraction of time compared to how we used to handle these data analytics challenges back in the day. Now, again, folks, I would appreciate you folks keep sending us more and more questions in the chat. We'll keep noting them and answering them, and we'll take more questions towards the end of the session where I'll be more than happy to answer those ones there as well. All right, so let's move further. Let me give you the 5-stage evolution of enterprise analytics because understanding where we have been explains why this moment is genuinely different, not just that next incremental upgrade. So let's first start here by talking about my stage one, which is my traditional on premises reports. How did that work in the past? Let me tell you, this is where I started working in the industry many, many moons back. How it used to work, IT used to own the data, and you would file a request to IT, wait for a few days, depending on how busy the team were. Essentially, what will happen is when the team members had a minute to actually look at your request, they're kind enough to, look at my request and provide me a static report that was already often out of date by the time it landed into a business exec's mailbox. Why that used to happen was that used to happen purely because my analytics was based on a service ticket that my exec would raise to my IT team. They will take some time and get back to me. The underlying reason for all of this was because my IT team was not just looking after processing that particular request, but they were actually looking after doing many different things. And that included things such as looking after my infrastructure, looking after my data warehouse solutions, looking after patching those solutions, looking after upgrading those solutions. So their end-to-end day was actually spent on tasks that required a lot of effort. However, it was low in value. And why I say it was low in value? Because at the end of the day, my business user, what they cared about was actually giving them the data that they really wanted at that particular minute to get insights that they could actually go ahead and leverage in order to make critical business decisions. It was as good as, starting a new partnership with another organization. It was as good as making informed decisions about a merger or acquisition capability. Those are just a few examples. Now, we moved a bit further. So we moved the dial here onto stage two, which is where I transitioned more onto those cloud scalable warehouses. Now, suddenly, what happened was that we could store and query data in a manner that was a bit more scalable and a lot more cheaper without me spending hundreds and thousands of dollars on buying those racks, buying my servers, buying my storage, pulling all of those things together and utilizing that. So That era of me building that data center essentially got taken away from me. And hand on heart, that was one of the great things that actually happened, because now my IT team could actually focus a bit more on my end user request, or I should say the request that delivered a lot more value to my business, rather than actually thinking about tasks that were low in value but they were really high in effort. So that was something that I actually had gone ahead and delivered as soon as I started leveraging these type of capabilities here. Now, stage three is where I would say this is sort of where we started to deliver a lot more self-service capabilities. So as soon as we entered this phase three, this is where we entered the era of self service BI, essentially a dashboard for everyone in my organization. This was huge. You had the likes of Tableau, Power BI, Looker, put visuals directly into my business users' hands. So you didn't have to really knock onto my IT team's desk every few minutes. I actually had these different tools that I could actually go ahead and leverage to build my own dashboards that were dynamic in nature. I could go to them, I can click on the refresh button, and there you go. In a matter of few seconds, I actually had got access to all of the data that was available to me that I could pretty much go ahead and use from there in itself and start to derive my insights. However, even though I could derive insights from this particular data in a manner of few minutes, I still had to do a lot more work. So yes, this data was readily available to me at a click of a button. However, what I had to do from that data was to make my own judgments, to make my own predictions, which essentially meant that I was still spending a lot of time and effort to analyze that data. And this is where I started to introduce various different AI capabilities in stage four and five, which actually became that real game changer for me. So in stage four, we move more towards that predictive machine learning forecasting, and not just describing what was done there, but we were also anticipating the future, i.e., which customers will churn, what demands would look like for the next month. So you could see there, using machine learning capability, I was being a lot more proactive on understanding based on my historical past trends, how things will evolve for me so that my teams can be on the front foot. As an example, based on, let's say, a customer spent in the last 4 months, if it becomes really evident that this customer has a higher probability to leave my organization, then my sales team could actually proactively go and have a chat with this customer, and they could identify the valid reasons why the consumer stopped interacting with me. And what that essentially meant was that now I had the capability where my sales team were a lot more proactive, and they were giving all that relevant attention to my customer based on the proactive signals that they were receiving. Now, to help humans a bit further is where we entered stage five, which is where we are today, which is my generative AI conversational insights. Now, this is where we are today. You don't build the dashboards, you don't actually look at AI to give you those insights. What you do is you simply go and start to ask questions. The system reasons, it retrieves and answers back to me in plain language. I'm not doing any SQL programming. I'm not writing any complex scripts. I'm not doing any funky stuff with Python. All I'm doing is I'm going to Google Gemini and I'm asking simple questions in natural plain language, such as in English. And then what it does to me is it actually comes back to me with all the relevant answers that I could potentially go ahead and use from there. Now, The interface to your data now becomes a conversation instead of a query language. That's the key power that you actually get from here. Think about it this way: how we have navigated cities. First, through a paper map that you would hold and interpret yourself. We then had GPSs that drew the route for me. I then had live traffic rerouting. And now you can just say to your favorite GPS application, let's just take an example of Google Maps. I could say to Google Maps, take me somewhere for good tacos that's open now and it's less crowded. It will figure out your intent, it will work out what's the best place for you, and it will point you to that right direction. Again, I didn't do anything special. What I just did was I asked it a simple question in natural language. So that's the power of generative AI that we are working with in today's environment. So again, folks, what we'll essentially go ahead and work towards more and more are these 8 different factors across the next 90 odd minutes. We'll first of all talk about the strategic role of generative AI in enterprise. We'll then talk about BigQuery's architecture and why serverless changes the economics and the speed. We'll then talk about Gemini's capability as a true analytics partner, not just as a chatbot. We'll then move further and talk about natural language analytics, asking questions of your data in plain English and getting trustworthy answers. We'll then move further and talk about automated reporting, letting the system draft the narrative, not just the numbers. We'll then look at real enterprise use cases across industries, including the likes of retail, finance, and healthcare. We'll then talk about security and governance. As we mentioned, the non negotiables that make this safe to deploy. And then lastly, we'll talk about how to build an AI powered strategy that you can go ahead and actually use and take this back to your team tomorrow so you can now think a bit more strategically rather than just thinking about doing these tasks in a bit more tactical manner, which is where your current state may look like. Now, let's talk about what underlying technology is something that we are going to go ahead and use in this particular session. The way I look at this one is there are 3 key pillars that essentially opens up this wide opportunity that I've talked about us here. The first one that we have got here is Google's BigQuery, a massive, scalable, serverless analytics warehouse. This is where my organization's data lives and get queried at petabyte scale. Think of this as the foundation and my muscle. The second one is my Google Gemini. This is my enterprise generative AI solution for reasoning and insight. This is the brain that understands your questions, it reasons over your results, and explains the answers in a language a human can act and understand. The third pillar here is my governed business intelligence and my visualization. This is where Looker comes into the picture. This is how insights reach business users in a trusted, consistent manner so that everyone in the company is looking at the same definition of revenue or the active customer. Now, focus on the word governed on the Looker. Why I say that is because very quietly, Looker is what is doing that heavy lifting for me. What it means is there's a single agreed upon definition of my metrics. So my sales team and my finance team don't show up to the meeting with 2 different numbers for the same thing. In a lot of organizations, half of the meetings are just spent arguing about whose spreadsheet is right, whose spreadsheet is wrong. Governance ends up becoming an argument. Now, look at the second workflow that I've got on this particular slide. You see here, I'm going all the way from data flows into BigQuery. Gemini reasons over it. Looker then presents it, and business users act on it. That's the assembly line for intelligence. Essentially, raw material on one end and your decisions that could then be utilized on the other hand. Let's take an analogy to understand this a bit better. If my BigQuery is the engine and Looker is the dashboard of my car, think about Gemini as the co-pilot who not only reads the gauge, but it also tells what to do about them. You are low on fuel, as an example. There's a petrol station that's 2 miles away from me. Takes the next exit. The engine gives me the power, the dashboard gives me the visibility, but the co pilot helps me with the judgment. Most companies today have the engine and they've got the dashboard. Co pilot is the newer part that I have added to the equation. One thing that I would like to call out here is that notice that these aren't three products that you have to rip and replace to adopt. They are actually designed to work together. And many of you have already used one or two pieces of this in your environment. So what you are just doing is you are just adding the third pillar. Another call out that I would probably like to do here is, again, as you start to embark on the journey of generative AI and as you start to go ahead and use these capabilities more and more, my humble suggestion to you will be, please always make sure that you keep yourself in the loop. You always fact check anything and everything that generative AI is producing for you, just so that you can make sure that you are fully aware of it and you can go ahead and use it in the most appropriate direction. So that's where I would actually go ahead and think about this capability. Now, look at this particular statement that I've got here in front of us. Our company has millions of records. Why are the decisions still taking weeks? Now, I've heard some version of this statement almost from every second organization where I've done a consulting engagement with, all the way from startups to global enterprises. And it's a reasonable question. It's a fact, it's a question. Essentially, every exec is asking their data heads. There is a real cognitive dissonance for our leaders. They know that my data exists. They know it. Why? Because they're paying a fortune to store that data. They're taking that risk to ensure that the data is stored securely within my environment, within my platform, yet getting a straight answer feels like, you know, punching the wall. The gap between we have the data and we have the answer is where the frustration lives today. Look at the pain points that I've got here. I can almost bet that several of these may feel very similar to you in your day-to-day context as well. Let's pick up on some of the most common type of pain points that I have captured across the board working with many different customers. The first one is my data silos. The numbers live in five systems that don't talk to each other, so no one has the whole picture. The second one is manual reporting. Someone's actually copying and pasting things from different places into slides. I can tell you I have done that in the past, sometimes at midnight, sometimes at early morning before the board meeting. What that means is, again, you are now pushing the human boundaries to that point where a human could genuinely make mistakes because they are overworked and they are doing things that are not genuinely adding values. I've then got the next one, which is my SQL dependency. Every question routes through a small team of specialists who have now become the bottleneck of my organization, unfortunately. They never wanted it to be. However, it's just where they are in that journey. The next one is slow insights. My dashboards are overloaded. I would say 20 dashboards and still no clear answer. I actually was working with an organization a few weeks back. That was an insight they actually had shared with me. And lastly, what this essentially means is delayed decisions. Here's what's frustrating, and I want to be really clear about this. None of this is because people aren't smart or they're not working hard. The analysts are brilliant. I've met thousands of them, and trust me, they are one of the most sharpest brains that you would find in an organization. However, looking at the amount of tasks my analysts are performing, they are unfortunately exhausted. It's purely because the processes force business questions through a technical bottleneck. The data exists, it's just trapped behind a translation step where a business question has to be converted into SQL by a scar specialist, then converted back into a story. Every translation adds delays and a chance for meaning to get lost. That's essentially the core problem that I'm essentially seeing across many different organizations that I want you folks to be thinking about, because if you haven't faced this problem today, trust me, this is going to come and reach your desk very quickly. Folks, today the real cost isn't that reporting delays are coming. It's unfortunately the delayed decisions is what is hurting my business more. The competitors who move fast, they churn those decisions in a manner of minutes. That essentially is the competitive advantage that they are gaining because they are thinking about using their data systems in a lot more fluid and agile manner. That is where I want us to be thinking about, because all of these different workflows, all of these different processes that I'm talking about here, all of these different pain points, they're all connected to one or the other. Let's take a quick recap of this. My data silos, they break the connection between my data and my engine. SQL dependency and manual reporting clog in the middle between the engine and the insight. My dashboards overload and delayed decisions break that last mile between my insights to action. So this isn't just a random set of complaints, it's actually a well thought diagnostics that you can think about. Wherever your worst pain is, that tells you exactly which seam to fix first. And that's genuinely something that you can go about and work towards. So, what actually breaks this cycle? That's the shift I want to show you next. The old ways versus the new ways side by side. Now, this slide is my favorite way to make the change concrete because it's not abstract. You can feel the difference. Only way versus the new way. So here I'm looking at my old ways as well as my new ways, and look at the difference in terms of time. Here I'm talking about weeks versus minutes. That's not a tuning improvement. That's a different category of experience. When I think about the old way is essentially a relay race with six hands off. I'm thinking about collection. I'm thinking about cleansing. I'm thinking about analysis. I'm thinking about building data. I'm then thinking about interpreting that data. And lastly, presentation of my data. Every step needs a different person or a different tool, and every handoff adds delay and a chance for something to get lost in translation. and my relay race now has nasty properties. The whole thing moves at the speed of the slowest leg and it breaks entirely if any runner drops my baton. If you are one of those SQL analysts is on vacation, you know the whole chain is going to stall. If the source data changes, you start over. It's fragile precisely because it's fragmented. These are the most common set of challenges that I foresee. Now, let's also focus on the new way. The new way collapses this into five fluid steps that mostly happen in one continuous conversation. You ask, analyze, explain, recommend, and act. All of this in plain language. The system analyzes at scale. It explains what it found in words. You understand, recommend what to do, and you act right there in the same session. No queuing, no handoff, no waiting for someone else to make up some free space in their calendar. None of that. Folks, the magic isn't just the speed, though the speed does matter enormously. It's just the fact that my business person now stays as my person in the driver's seat the whole time. No handoff to a SQL expert, no waiting for reports to get queued, no game of telephone where my questions get misinterpreted a few times. The question and the answer is taken care of in the same session, in the same minute by the same person. And that's the closeness which is actually making a lot of difference here in my day to day. Think about it this way. It's the difference between mailing a letter and having a phone call. With the letter, you write your question, you send it, you wait for a few days, you get a reply that doesn't quite address what you meant, and you then have to unfortunately write again. With a phone call, you can just ask questions, you can ask follow up questions immediately at the same time, and you can close off the end to end workflow there and then. The new way turns my analytics from correspondence into a real conversation. That's essentially where I'm heading towards. Now, let's move further and let's talk about how all of this can actually be made possible. Because none of this would work without me having a stable and a sustainable warehouse platform that can work at scale. And this is where, folks, what we are going to be doing is we are actually going to be talking about Google's BigQuery platform. All right. Now, up until now, we have talked about the why, the flood of data, the trapped insights, weeks to minutes promise. Now, let's talk about the how part, starting with the foundation everything is built on. Google's BigQuery is what we are going to be utilizing here. It is a serverless platform for my enterprise analytics engine for processing petabytes of data that can scale my analytics. And I can do that in a lot more easy and simplified manner without unnecessarily bringing a human into consideration. So let's focus on this for a few minutes. Let's understand this from an end to end perspective. So, why BigQuery? Let me start with what BigQuery is. As I mentioned earlier, BigQuery is Google's serverless, highly scalable analytics warehouse capable of analyzing petabytes of data in seconds. Let that scale sink in. A petabyte is million gigs. If a single gig were one brick, think about a petabyte would be a brick wall stretching most of the way across a wide set of locations. and BigQuery reads the whole wall in time it takes to in time, I would say that will take you to sip a cup of coffee. I'm talking about a few seconds here. Let's now talk about what are some of the key characteristics that actually empower this serverless cloud-based architecture. The first one is my serverless architecture. There are no clusters for you to manage. Google runs the machinery, they patch it, they replace the failed hardware, they scale it all invisibly. The second one is high speed SQL analytics. It answers in seconds using SQL that your team is already aware of. There's no exotic new language to learn, nothing of those stuffs. The third one is automatic scaling. This is where it flexes elastically to know any workload, whether that's one's analyst on a Tuesday morning or 10,000 queries on a Black Friday spike. The next one is my enterprise grade security, governed and compliant, which we'll dig a bit later with encryption at rest and in transit by default. All of this model is actually fueled by pay only for what you actually use consumption model. So you're not thinking of buying giant servers that may be sitting idle for most part of my month. I'm actually going to be paying for things that I'm using at a specific period of time. And lastly is my multi-cloud connectivity through a capability that we have got called BigQuery Omni. You can analyze data living in other clouds too without first dragging all of that data into Google. That's where all of this comes into considerations, comes into the picture that I can go ahead and use. All right. Now let me walk you through the BigQuery architecture. Let's go one by one and let's look at how my raw data becomes an executive decision. At the top, you would see are my enterprise applications, my IoTs, my ERP systems, my CRMs, my API, my files. This is essentially where my data is born. Every customer clicks, every purchase order, every sensor reading, every support ticket. Next is my data ingestion layer. Services such as my cloud storage, my pub sub model, my data flows, as well as my data streams, which is where my data is actually moving, whether in big overnight batches or streaming in real time, event by event as it happens. Then the heart of it, which is where my BigQuery itself comes into the picture. Now, as I mentioned, it is a serverless storage platform plus a distributed querying engine, and both of these they work along with each other. On top sits my AI and BI layer, Gemini, Looker, Vertex, AI. And what these do essentially is they turn queries into reasoning, dashboards, and visuals, and it all culminates into my business decisions, faster, data driven, and exec ready, which essentially means my execs can now focus on attending those important business meetings and making those decisions in a fraction of time rather than actually working through the unnecessary details from there in itself. So that's essentially where this capability comes into the consideration that I can go ahead and leverage as part of my day to day. All right, let's really nail what serverless actually means because it's the word that people get at a higher level, but we don't sometimes really appreciate the depth and the value that it really adds into my day to day life. Folks, the traditional warehouse is a to-do list of pain. That's how I look at it today. I'm thinking about provisioning servers, managing clusters, tuning my databases, planning for my peak load, and all this is adding up to a high operational overhead. Let's make this a bit more concrete. Someone on your team has to guess how much capacity you will need in the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. They'll order it, they'll install it, configure it, and then spend their weeks keeping the lights on instead of finding the real insights. Worst, you have to size for your busiest day, the Black Friday deal, the Christmas Day sales, the end of quarter, the product launch dates. So for the other 350 odd other days in my calendar year, you're paying for the horsepower that is sitting idle. That's my capital being locked up into a machine that after 3 years will become redundant and I'll probably have to go and spend more money to upgrade it. On the other hand, I've got my BigQuery serverless capability. I'm not provisioning anything. I'm not thinking about buying hardware. All what I'm doing is I'm thinking about automatic scaling. I'm thinking about its high availability. I'm thinking about its elastic capability. So now my team can focus more on the business outcomes. There's no cluster to size because there's no cluster that you're owning. When a query actually lands into my environment, Google shares the infrastructure and it quietly assembles the compute to run it and it then dissolves it when I'm sitting in my quiet period. So I'm not paying for that ideal time that I was traditionally paying for in my earlier instances. Let's go further and let's talk about my performance engine. And the number on the right tells you the exact story. The same question that used to take a traditional warehouse, essentially hours, takes BigQuery minutes, often seconds. That's the right hand column. Hours, seconds is what I'm thinking about. This isn't marketing stats, folks. It's actually the practical difference between three very different ways of working. And how does it happen? Four things are working together. Here I'm using my columnar storage. So instead of storing data row by row like a spreadsheet, BigQuery actually stores it in column by column. So when you query, only you query things that are relevant in your scenario. It could be your revenue, it could be your region. It reads only those two columns and ignores all the other 50 columns. It's not wasting a single ounce of effort on the data that you didn't ask for. The next one is distributed execution. Thousands of workers attack the problem in parallel. That's how you crunch a petabyte of data faster, by splitting it in thousands of smaller pieces that are solved simultaneously. You've then got automatic optimization. No manual indexing or tuning. The system figures out efficient path in itself. So you don't need a specialist handcrafting each query. And then I've got intelligent caching. Ask the same question again and it returns instantly from memory, no recomputation. That's essentially how I get my answers in seconds rather than actually spending hours to weeks. Now, folks, BigQuery is more than a data warehouse. The way I think about it today is I think about it as an ecosystem. This is where a lot of differentiation actually comes in. Picture BigQuery as essentially a sun and orbiting around a set of capabilities that each expand what your data can do without your data even having to leave its home. Around the core, you've got your big lake, which unifies your data lake, so structured tables and unstructured files. You've got images, documents, logs, and all of these things play together under one governance model. That's something that you really need to be thinking about on how it actually comes in and it actually helps you out from here in itself. So that's something that you need to be aware of. You've got Vertex AI for full sophisticated model development where your data scientist really needs it. You've got BigQuery ML, and this is one of the most favorite service for many folks. Machine learning inside the database using plain SQL queries. You've got vector search for semantic search, which is what powers my modern AI retrieval. And it lets me find things by meaning rather than exact keywords. Gemini as then my assistant, which is woven throughout my solution. And then lastly, Looker for dashboards and governed self-service capability. So that's essentially how my end-to-end workflow, my end-to-end capability actually works that I really need to be aware of. All right. Now I'm seeing some really good questions coming from everyone in the chat. Please keep sending them through. We'll do our best to keep answering them as we are going through the session, and we'll take some of the other ones right at the end again as well. All right. Moving further, BigQuery plus machine learning, or to make it simple, it's essentially BigQuery ML. Now that's my headline. I build, train, and deploy models directly in SQL without moving data outside of my warehouse. Again, the model is created with the same language that your analysts are already using every single day. Why is that a big deal? Simply because traditionally, machine learning belonged to a small priesthood of my data scientists who used to write Python, wrangling libraries, and managing separate training infrastructure. It was scarce, it was expensive, and slow to process. On the other hand, BigQuery ML lets me write my existing SQL analytics built models with a few extra lines of familiar code. Literally, it's almost like creating a model statement that looks a lot like my create tables in SQL that you folks have been used to for many, many years. You've just multiplied the number of people in your org who can do predictive work from a handful specialist to your entire analyst ecosystem. Now, let's further talk about what are some of the key things that actually make these things possible. So let's talk about my real-time analytics. Making decisions as my events are happening, not after hours or days, at the same minute. Now, this is the shift from studying history to watching the present unfold live. Look at the live data sources that I've got here on the screen as a few common ones. Your website activity, your clicks and sessions as they happen. So you can see a check out page failing while someone is still on it. You've got your pause transactions. That essentially means my live sales across every store. So a regional search or a sudden dead zone shows up immediately. My IoT sensors, equipments and environment telemetry, the heartbeat of my machines and my facilities. Logistics tracking, shipments and fleet in motion, essentially a live map of where everything is right now. Now, how does the data actually get here so fast? This is all thanks to my streaming ingestion. Services such as my PubSub and Dataflow pipe events into BigQuery continuously. So my rows are variable movement after they occur rather than waiting for tonight's batch load. The same fast query engine we have discussed. Let's now go ahead and move further in this particular instance. Let's now think about me asking questions of that live stream instantaneously. And the business impact on the left is where it gets exciting. Detecting issues instantaneously instead of waiting for a report, monitoring operations live. And my favorite one is respond, don't react. So I'm essentially moving from hindsight to foresight. That's essentially the power that I'm talking about in this particular instance. Now, let's ground all of this into a real enterprise success story, a global retail chain. Let me walk you through their problem, solution, and the outcomes because that's how you should evaluate any technology decision you bring back to your own organization. So, if a vendor can't tell you the problem, the mechanism, and measurable result, be skeptical. In this particular instance, our customer, their regional sales report required multiple teams and more than 24 hours just to consolidate. Picture the reality behind the sentence here. Analysts in different regions, each pulling their own extract, emailing the spreadsheets around, someone stitching them together by hand overnight, reconciling mismatched numbers by morning. By the time leadership saw those numbers, the day was gone and the numbers were already stale. They were, in effect, always steering the business by looking into a rear view mirror. Let's talk about the AI powered solution. They ended up using BigQuery to unify their data from their stores, their e commerce, inventory, and supply chain into a single analytics platform. One source of truth instead of dozens of disconnected spreadsheets. No more whole numbers are right or wrong debates that used to happen in every Monday meeting. Everyone drew information from the same live data sets that were essentially being provided to my stakeholders. So you could see from a business outcome perspective, reporting went from hours to minutes. They got unified reporting, faster decisions, and real inventory visibility across the whole chain. That inventory visibility is quietly the biggest benefit. Knowing exactly what's on every shelf and in every warehouse in near real time is the difference between a lost sale and something that you won. And this is where I get the most amount of benefits from this particular capability. So, folks, hopefully that gave you a good view, a good perspective on how I can actually go ahead and leverage BigQuery as my analytics platform that I could actually go ahead and use in such type of scenarios from here in itself. So this is something that I really want us to be thinking about because when I think about my analytics engine, we've been through a journey as an industry. And this is where we are actually seeing a lot more benefits from this particular capability. Now, what we are going to be doing in the next section is we'll, we'll now go ahead and explore how on top of my BigQuery, which has already given me the speed and scale, how can I now go ahead and ask BigQuery as a platform a lot of questions in simple natural language, which is where my Gemini based Gen AI capabilities come into the picture, and essentially how these capabilities actually help me out with a lot of responses that I could go ahead and leverage in my day-to-day interface, in my day-to-day environments that I can now go ahead and leverage from here in itself. Now, again, keep sending us all of your questions in the chat. We are looking at all of them very closely here. All right. Now let's take a quick 5 minutes break and then I'll start on the remaining topics after the break.
Sure, we are now going to take a 5-minute break, but before we do that, we are going to launch a quick poll that we want to invite you to participate in. Doing so helps us know how we can better serve you by telling us who might be interested in more information or in taking some additional training. In addition, we have a lot more informative webinars coming up, so please go to netcomlearning.com/webinars in order to register.